Hi everyone, this is Ken Stoltz. This is the first of 5 video lectures I'll be doing for the clinical psychology class at LCC. And so what we're going to be doing for the next 5 weeks is talking about different fields of practice within clinical psychology. So each week there'll be a short lecture from me, usually 20 to 30 minutes, and then a quiz posted on Moodle. And that quiz is, as I said in class, that's an open book quiz, open notes quiz. Really, my goal in giving you the quiz is just to make sure that you've watched the video and that you've read the textbook. So please be doing both. Watch the lecture and also read the textbook. And if you do that, you should have no problem with the quiz. So tonight, we're going to be talking about clinical child psychology. We're going to be talking specifically about working with children. Historically, psychology sort of treated children as young adults. And so whatever was done with kids or with adults would sort of be done with kids as well. Now, obviously, we understood children didn't function at the same level as adults, but really what we were doing was not different interventions or a different approach, but just kind of maybe a slower or less intensive version of what was done with adults. And this is sort of interesting. So there's some cultural factors at work in how children are viewed, and I think the modern view of children has really just emerged over the last 100 years or so, where there's this understanding that children aren't just little adults, but that they're really in a unique age and a unique stage of their life. And we have people like Erickson and other developmental theorists that over time kind of helped us to understand that children are at a different stage of development than adults, and they need to be treated differently. And so what's happened is over the past 30 or 40 years, as we've learned more about child development, as psychology has matured as a field, we've realized that there's a need for specific techniques when we work with children. So we need to assess them in different ways. We need to intervene in different ways. And tonight we're just going to talk a little bit more about that. A little bit of background about working with children, and specifically about a factor or a concept that we refer to as resilience. And the idea behind resilience is, the word resilience in English means to bend, to be able to bend and to be flexible and to spring back into shape. And so one of the things we're interested about when we look at working with children, trying to help children who are dealing with various types of clinical issues, is what's unique about the children that are able to go through a really difficult circumstance or a really difficult situation and be okay and kind of bounce back into shape. What distinguishes them from the children who can't do that? And so we call that factor resilience. So resilience kind of looks at risk factors and protective factors. And some of the risk factors, and these are sort of obvious, they're listed in your book. Obviously, individual characteristics like your temperament, your character, this can be a risk factor, right? There are certain people that just seem from birth to have more difficult interactions with other people, to have problematic behaviors. And we're not always exactly sure why that's the case, but that's certainly a risk factor then for later problems in life. Some other risk factors that we know about: parental conflict. If parents are arguing and fighting all the time, children grow up with this idea that home and relationships really aren't stable, they're not safe, and that seems to have a very pervasive effect throughout their life course, unless there's some sort of intervention or unless there's some protective factors to kind of mitigate that. For obvious reasons, physical abuse, sexual abuse would also be risk factors for children not having resilience, for children having further problems. And I think the reasons for that are fairly obvious. That, again, if you can't trust the people who are close to you to take good care of you, to treat you right, you learn not to trust the world. You learn to have kind of a suspicious and paranoid disposition, and you learn often to be aggressive and to fend for yourself, or to sort of be a doormat and to just kind of accept whatever anyone does to you. And so those obviously aren't good situations, and don't predict a good outcome for the child. Another risk factor that we often talk about is poverty. Children who grow up in poverty, often, there's something about being poor that makes life very difficult. And it's not just the absence of money, but it's the lack of stability. There's often a lack of future orientation. In the U.S., we often talk about poor people as shopping at the convenience stores, right? The stores that are attached to gas stations and that sort of thing. And some people think, well, why is that a problem? Well, 2 reasons. One, the food that's sold there isn't very healthy, and 2, it's usually twice as expensive as it would be in a grocery store or a supermarket. And so then you think, well, why would poor people shop at a store like that? In the U.S., it's often because they don't have transportation to another place, it's to a supermarket. It's also because there's something about living in poverty that makes you very focused on just getting through today. And so the idea of putting together a shopping list, going to the store, coming home, that's often sort of foreign to people. And so it's much easier just to kind of run up to the store, grab whatever is there, and bring it home. And then this has effects for the whole family, right? There's nutrition issues. There are issues with kind of not having enough food in the house because it's often, just a little bit is bought at a time. And so that's just one example of how poverty kind of shapes an individual's life course. So if you grow up in poverty, the theory goes you sort of learn not to think ahead, not to plan ahead. You sort of learn to live in the moment because those are the survival skills that you need. And to some degree, that's a good thing, but it does seem to change people's life course. So there's some of the risk factors, and what we're looking at, we've all got some risk factors. None of us have perfect lives. What we look at with resilience is that hopefully the risk factors are sort of balanced out or even outweighed by protective factors. And so the protective factors are sort of obvious too. These are things like education. We know that the more educated someone becomes, the better the life that they and their family tend to have. And so we look not just at education for children, but are their parents educated? Having educated parents is a protective factor. One of the biggest protective factors is a connection with a caring, responsible adult. What's interesting about this is that this adult doesn't necessarily have to be your parent. Ideally, it would be your parent. The parent is really important. I'm not diminishing the importance of the parent. But even if your parents are sort of irresponsible, but if you've got some teachers and a coach and some neighbors and some extended family that are caring and responsible, that often makes a difference. It's not as good as having a responsible, caring parent, but it does provide some measure of protectiveness. Another thing that we look at sometimes in terms of a protective factor is socioeconomic stability. Is this a family that has some resources, some economic resources? And that seems to make a difference in children's lives. Something else I didn't mention here, but that's often talked about as a protective factor, is religion and spirituality. And I mentioned that in our last in-person lecture in Klaipeda. But people who are religious and spiritual, they and their families tend to have better outcomes. And so just as an example, we know that children and young people who attend church are much less likely to abuse drugs and alcohol. And so that's an example of a protective factor. So again, we look at resilience occurring when the protective factors kind of outweigh or mitigate the risk factors. An example of this that, somebody that's often thought about as being very resilient is Dave Pelzer, who I mentioned before. Dave is the subject of 3 books. The first and the most popular, most well-known one is A Child Called It. And in that book, it describes Dave's life growing up as an abused child. And I mentioned this in class, so I won't go through the whole story. What's interesting about the next 2 books in the series, though, is it talks about how Dave was removed from his family and how he got in with a series of foster parents, some of whom had his best interests at heart, others of whom were just kind of giving him a place to live and collecting the checks that came with caring for him as a foster child. But anyway, one of the things that happened was there was an adult in his neighborhood, one of the last places he lived, and that adult had been in the military. He took an interest in Dave's life. He helped him get into the military after he graduated from high school, helped him, I think, purchase a car and do some things like that. And even though this wasn't a parent or even a foster parent, he helped Dave to kind of develop some of those protective factors. He himself served as one of those protective factors by being a caring, responsible adult. So if you want a good example of resilience, those books, they'd be very interesting books for anybody in psychology to read. They're very easy to read. They're just sort of written as one person's story. Excuse me, but great example of resilience. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the unique aspects of treating children. One of the things that's interesting about treating children that's different from treating adults is how children get to us in the first place. How do they get to our office? Usually a child doesn't call you and say, hey, I'm really having a problem. I need some help from a counselor. That just really doesn't happen. Usually children are referred by parents or teachers. And so right from the very beginning, one of the things that's different is that they're not coming in of their own volition, but they're coming because someone else is usually kind of forcing them or at least suggested it and kind of pushed them to come in and see you. Often, too, they don't quite understand what a counselor is for, what a clinical psychologist is for, and what's going to happen in those sessions. And adults don't always understand that either, but children understand it even less. They don't kind of have a framework for really thinking about what's going to happen next in a clinical session. Another unique aspect of treating children would be confidentiality. Usually we think about everything that a client tells us as being confidential unless they've signed some sort of release of information form. It's different with children. If children tell us something, we're often sharing that with their parents or with their teachers, and the laws and the rules about this are different depending on where you practice. In the U.S., there's often an age of consent, and I remember when I lived in Pennsylvania, the age of consent was 14. So when someone was over 14, they could actually sign themselves up for clinical psychology treatment, and their parent didn't have to be notified, and their parent didn't necessarily have a right to know what went on there unless that teenager signed a release form saying that we could talk to the parent. Other places that age would tend to be 18, and I don't know what it is in the various countries that all of you are from, but it would be an interesting thing to find out. I know for research purposes in Lithuania, young people 16 and over can actually give consent to be involved in research. I don't know if it's the same thing for clinical treatment or not. Another unique aspect of treating children is the context of their behavior is often not something they can control. And so with adults, we might say something like, hey, it seems like you drink a lot of alcohol when you hang out with Joe and Bob and Bill in the bar. Why don't you stop going to the bar? Children have much less control over where they go and the circumstances they live under. And so, we can't really say to them, well, it really seems like you fight with your brother all the time, so why don't you just not hang out with your brother very much? That, the child that we're treating and the brother might share the same room. Certainly they're living in the same house. And the child just doesn't have that much control over where he goes and what he does. And so some of the really simple, effective things we might try to work on with clients if they were adults, they're harder to do with children. There are also developmental considerations. And, one of the things that we need to think about as clinical psychologists is what stage of development is the child that we're treating in. And so if this is a teenager, we're not really surprised by rebellious behavior. That doesn't mean we encourage or accept the rebellious behavior. But in some ways, we're almost worried, right, about children who aren't developed, or about teenagers who aren't developing their own identity. But that same sort of behavior in a 5-year-old is really problematic. Another example would be sexuality. If we have a teenager who's exploring, sexual behaviors, interested in the opposite sex, maybe has even, experimented to some degree, been involved in sexual activities, that's not really very abnormal in most cultures. However, if we've got a 5-year-old who's doing those things, we start to think that there's something problematic going on. And often with children that young, if they're, if they know a lot about sex, if they're involved in sexual behaviors, we start to think that they might have been sexually abused because they kind of know too much. Now, there's a natural curiosity about those things that happens with young children, but when they have too much knowledge or when they're acting out too much, we tend to think, okay, there's something developmentally that's not right here, and that's kind of a warning sign. So that's a little bit different than working with adults, where adults, when you work with adults, they're usually at similar stages of development, and so we don't have quite those warning signs in quite the same way. Another thing that we want to be aware of in treating children is parent-child interactional patterns. And what we're talking about here is the way that parents often unintentionally reinforce the very behaviors that have caused them to bring the child in for treatment. And so, for example, a child who's throwing temper tantrums, if that temper tantrum gets the child what he or she wants, there's a reinforcer there, right? You guys understand that behavioral principle that if a child throws a temper tantrum and the parent gives the child candy to get them to stop the temper tantrum, we know they've just reinforced the whole idea that something good happens when I throw a temper tantrum. And so often one of our tasks in treating children is to try to help the parents see that what they're doing is actually reinforcing the very thing that they're trying to stop. And so a lot of times with parents, we try to help them to learn to give their children natural consequences. Because sometimes even paying attention to a behavior can be reinforcing. So for an example that we use sometimes of that is if a child and a parent get into a big argument every morning before school about the child wearing their coat, that argument, that parent attending that child closely, spending kind of, one-on-one time with that child arguing about the coat, for some children that's very reinforcing. Even though it's negative attention, that attention is very reinforcing. So a lot of times what we do with parents that have fallen into this unintentional reinforcement pattern is we try to help them to let their children have natural consequences. So we say, hey, instead of fighting with your child to wear his coat, every morning before he goes to school, and then he kind of gets into fighting with you. He gets an adrenaline rush out of that. He gets some attention out of it. Why don't you just let him go to school without the coat once or twice, and he'll be really cold, and he'll probably just start wearing it, and you don't have to kind of get into this pattern of fighting with him, which might really be reinforcing the thing that you're trying to change. The next bullet point really links to what I just said a moment ago, but one of the things about working with children that's very important is that we need to involve their families in treatment because they're dependent on their parents, because they're dependent on, these older people, their guardians, their parents to kind of set the standard for how they live, and because the parents are sort of in charge of the home environment, we really need the parents to be involved in treatment. And so I've joked in class before about the family that will drop their children off in treatment and say, hey, I'm going to go to the store, why don't you just go ahead and counsel them? It's sort of this idea that it's sort of like dropping your car off at the mechanic, that you can just kind of drop it off and leave. Often the very first message we need to send that family is, no, even if you're not causing the problem, you're going to be intimately involved in helping to solve it and in maintaining any sort of changes that are made. And so that's a very important message to get out to almost all families. There are occasionally some exceptions to that, but usually the family needs to be heavily involved. Another unique aspect of working with children is they, for obvious reasons, have a limited attention span. And so we often do 45 or 50-minute clinical sessions in the U.S., and I think that's fairly standard other places. It's going to be very hard to get a child to sit and talk with you for 50 minutes, for almost an hour. That's probably just not going to happen. So we're going to need to have other strategies, other ways of interacting with that child. We might need to have shorter sessions. When I was working with children, I would often just meet with them for 25 minutes or 30 minutes rather than the full 50 minutes because they couldn't pay attention that long. If we do keep them that long, then we need to think about some interactive activities, some things that they can kind of engage in. The final thing that's difficult about doing clinical work with children, are definitely unique, is that they have a very concrete understanding. They have limited insight and limited life experience. So some of the building blocks of therapy, which is helping people to be able to look at, what's happened in the past, what they want in the future, kind of being able to think abstractly about what's going on in your head, this metacognition, thinking about thinking, that's all going to be very hard for children because they just don't have the insight and the life experience to really understand that. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about some of the common disorders that clinical psychologists encounter when they're working with children. One of the things that's relevant here is, as you all know, I think nearly all of you have had the abnormal psychology class. Just in the past year, or just a little over a year, the DSM-5 has replaced the DSM-4. So in the DSM-4, which was still being used when your textbook was written, there's this category called disorders usually first diagnosed in infancy, childhood, or adolescence. As you know, or as you should know, the DSM-5 no longer has this category. So what's happened has been that the disorders that are often first diagnosed in childhood have gotten put into different places. So I wanted to just review this a little bit. And again, if you've had abnormal psych, this should just be review for you. But I just wanted to mention this. So one of the places that a lot of the disorders are commonly diagnosed in childhood and infancy, one of the places those disorders got placed now is what's called neurodevelopmental disorders. And this makes sense, right? These are things that we neurodevelopmental disorders are disorders that we're going to notice usually early in the person's life course. So one of these disorders, and one that's, as you probably know from abnormal psychology, one that's just grown exponentially in terms of how often it's diagnosed and the number of children affected with it, is autism. And we used to have discrete diagnoses. We used to have autism, Asperger's disorder, and then we had pervasive developmental disorder, or PDD, not otherwise specified, or PDD-NOS. And what's happened in the new DSM and the DSM-5 is that they've put Asperger's and PDD on an autism spectrum. So instead, before it was sort of like you either have autism or you have some of these related disorders. Now what they'd say is if you have Asperger's, you're on the high functioning end of the autism spectrum. And so this is important because so many children are diagnosed with autism. We're going to talk in a little bit about some of what we do with people with autism, but we'll come back to that in a moment. The next disorder that I want to mention is social communication disorder. This is also a new disorder. This is when individuals have the social but not the behavioral symptoms of autism. And so, people with autism tend to be very awkward socially. They don't have good social skills. They don't connect to other people. So this would be where the individuals have the social deficits, but they don't have some of the traditional autism behaviors like the repetitive behavior, the toe walking, those sorts of things. Some other neurodevelopmental disorders that you might run into with children, specific learning disorders, learning disorders with reading or math or those sorts of things. Also intellectual disabilities. This is what we used to call mental retardation. These are often diagnosed early in childhood. And what we do with people with intellectual disabilities is, again, different than what we do with even though treating children is different than adults, treating people with intellectual disabilities is even more different. And because often these are people that aren't going to develop the capability to think reflectively and to think reflectively about their behavior and their social interactions and those sorts of things. So often we have to do very concrete work with people with intellectual disabilities. Some other common disorders that are first diagnosed in childhood: communication disorders, motor disorders, oppositional defiant and conduct disorder, and these have been moved to a new category as well. Separation anxiety and selective mutism, pica and rumination disorders, enuresis and encopresis. These are elimination disorders of children soiling or wetting themselves. And then reactive attachment disorder, which we discussed briefly in class. That's another disorder that's often diagnosed in children. What's interesting about reactive attachment disorder is it has very antisocial symptoms. And so some people sort of suspect that people who have reactive attachment disorder may actually grow up to become people who are diagnosed, in some cases, certainly not in all cases, with antisocial personality disorder. So some treatment approaches I wanted to mention. One very common approach with children is behavioral interventions. We talked in class about behavior modification. I actually gave you a case study with some examples of behavior modification. We talked about token economies and things like that. And basically, I think you guys know from earlier psychology classes, behavior modification involves reinforcing desired behaviors and punishing undesirable behaviors. That's a very gross oversimplification, but that's the general idea. Some other more sophisticated behavioral approaches we might use. One that's very closely related that I actually didn't list here, but I wanted to mention, is what's called applied behavior analysis, and that's actually used with children with autism. And applied behavior analysis involves often 30 to 40 hours a week with a very young child. We know that autism can often be diagnosed at 2 or 3 years old, and the research has found that the earlier the interventions take place, the better the outcome is. And so this applied behavior analysis was developed by a professor at a California university here in the U.S., and his last name was Lovaas. So Dr. Lovaas developed this applied behavior analysis, and it basically involves a therapist working with a child for 30 to 40 hours a week, and basically reinforcing. It's sort of an advanced form of behavior modification. It's reinforcing any sort of skills that the child develops. And often this involves learning to say words, learning letters, learning to do some self-care activities, but just a lot of repetition and then immediate reinforcement. Often the reinforcement is in the form of verbal praise. There used to be punishment involved, but that's kind of been phased out over the years. That's not really so much a part of the applied behavior analysis or the ABA. Some other behavioral approaches would be social and problem-solving skills training. Teaching children how to interact with other people. That's teaching social skills. Teaching children what to do when there's a problem with other children, when there's a problem in relationships. These are sort of behavioral approaches too. We're often trying to get them to act a different way and then reinforcing them when they do that. Another thing that sometimes comes up in specific capacities or specific situations would be exposure therapies. Children that are afraid of something to the point where they have been diagnosed with a phobia, we often treat that by gradually exposing them to whatever they're afraid of. But we do that very slowly, very gradually. So we might, if we have a child that's very afraid of dogs, we might start with just putting a picture of a dog in close proximity to them. And then gradually we'd move to maybe a stuffed animal dog. And then eventually, hopefully by the end of treatment, that child could be in the presence of a real dog. But we kind of gradually, slowly expose them to dogs, and not even real dogs at first. So that would be another behavioral approach that we sometimes use with children. There are also some cognitive approaches. The most famous, of course, would be cognitive behavioral therapy, and this is used with children. Now, with children, it's obviously it has to be simplified a bit. So things like getting a child to identify self-talk, we're going to really be trying to change how we talk about that with them. We're going to be trying to get them to come to understand the messages that they're sending themselves that might be dysfunctional, and help them to try to start to develop more kind of healthy messages that they give themselves, to learn to tell them new things. So the child who makes a mistake at school and says, "Oh, I'm stupid, I'll never learn this," in their head, obviously we want to help them to change that to, "Okay, I didn't do well this time, but I can do it next time." So it's an example of the sort of self-talk we might be working on with children. Another cognitive approach that works well with children, and actually with other individuals too who aren't as high functioning as adults, even with people with intellectual disabilities, is what's called reality therapy. And reality therapy is sort of interesting. It was developed by a man named William Glasser, a psychiatrist. And Glasser was just really an interesting guy. He was a frustrated Freudian psychoanalyst, and he kind of reached his limit when he was working with a boy and trying to do Freudian play therapy with him. And the boy would come in and punch him and throw the play therapy toys and just be, really just, a horrible client. And Glasser just dreaded working with his child every week. And he was trained to kind of sit back and interpret this child's behavior. Finally, he decided he just couldn't take that anymore. And so the child comes in, and Glasser kind of tells him, "Hey, we're going to live in reality now. You can't throw things around. You can't hit people. I don't recommend doing this." This was, in the 1950s, and you could get away with this. He told the boy, "If you throw my stuff, I'm going to throw your stuff. If you hit me, I'm going to hit you back." And I don't think he really did that, but he told him, "This is real life, this is reality, and this is how it works." Over time, that developed into something a little bit more professional, which is called reality therapy. But Glasser was the person who developed this. Reality therapy basically says that people learn how to meet their own needs, and that even dysfunctional behavior often meets a need in some way. And so Glasser said we need to teach people how to meet their needs in more functional ways. And because this is a pretty simple approach, it does work with children, it works with low-functioning individuals. But Glasser really has kind of 4 steps in this model. He says we need to think about, what do people want, what are they doing, and then we need to get them to evaluate whether what they're doing is going to get them what they want, and then we want to get them to plan to better meet their own needs. And so if this boy who's coming into the therapist throwing the toys and acting crazy, what does he want? Well, he probably wants to be doing something else besides coming to therapy. What's he doing? Well, what he's doing is acting crazy, which is going to keep him in therapy. So when the therapist evaluates that with him, the child can often very quickly start to see, hey, if I come in and throw toys, I'm actually going to have to keep doing this. And that's just kind of a simple example of how reality therapy would work. And, it is the kind of thing that it can work well with children. Not as well known as cognitive behavioral therapy and behavioral and some of the other approaches, but it's something I like. It's effective in a lot of cases. Another example of a treatment that's used with children that you might be interested in is play therapy. And I think some of you have heard about this. The premise here is that children express themselves through play. So a child is often not going to sit down in a chair across from you and tell you about their feelings and their deepest, darkest secrets. But if you have a dollhouse with some dolls that represent mom and dad and different children, they might start to act out what's going on in their family using those dolls. And then we can start to understand what's happening with them. We can help them using the dolls or using the toys to act out different ways of dealing with situations. And all of a sudden we're using play as a way of expressing the child's emotions and of even intervening. And we know that children often work through issues with play. Just a silly example of this, but when my daughter was growing up, she was really sort of freaked out and afraid by the story of Little Red Riding Hood. The story where this folk story, right, or this fairy tale about the girl who is taking food to her grandmother, and there's a wolf that's trying to eat her and those sorts of things. And one of the things I noticed is that when my daughter was so afraid of the story, she often wanted to play Little Red Riding Hood. And so I was kind of, one time I was saying to a friend of mine who's a psychologist, I don't know why she wants to play this all the time when she's so afraid of the story. And my friend said, well, she's actually, she's working through her issues with the story through play, and that's what kids do. And it was really a good point, and it was kind of a perspective that as her father I hadn't thought of. So play, we can use play in therapy to let children kind of work through these things that they're dealing with in the real world. So I mentioned the dolls in the dollhouse. Sometimes play therapy involves doing art with children. Sometimes we use a sand tray where it's just like what it sounds, a tray full of sand that children can draw in. They can move figures and toys to the sand. The sand often lets people sort of stand up a small object or a small, figure in the sand. And so it kind of just is another environment that we can use. You can have formal training in play therapy, and if you want to work with children, I highly recommend that. I will say I was never a specialist in children. I worked with children occasionally when they came into my office. I kind of just worked with everybody for a while at one of my jobs. But I never worked a lot with children. I never had formal training in play therapy because I wasn't a child specialist. But even without formal training, I'd often go to our play therapy room, and I found that just doing things with a child in that room often helped them to talk to me. They came to trust me differently than if we just kind of sat in my office and did just boring talking, right? For a child, that's really not what they want to do. So just for example, I would often, there was one young boy I was working with, maybe 8 years old. He and I would often go in this play therapy room, and there was a little toy basketball hoop, and, just less than 2 meters high probably, but he and I would shoot baskets, and while we were shooting baskets, we'd be talking about his day at school, and we'd be talking about his treatment goals and that sort of thing. But shooting the baskets gave him something to do rather than just kind of sitting in my office. So even if you're not formally trained in play therapy, playing with children during therapy can be very helpful. It helps them to trust you, helps them to open up more with you, gives them something to do with their body while they're talking to you, and that can be really effective. Another aspect that we need to think about with child psychology is intervening with the family, and I've already mentioned that that's going to be important. In the U.S., there's a couple different ways we do that. One would be traditional family therapy, which we talked about earlier in the course, where the family comes in and meets with a therapist in the office. There have also, though, in recent years been some interesting developments where the therapy actually happens in the home. And the idea here is that we see more of the real circumstances in the home, that when children are acting a certain way and parents are acting a certain way, sometimes they come into the office and they clean that up. They don't act that way in our office. If we go to their house, we're much more likely to see what's really going on. And so these home-based programs or wraparound programs, they become much more popular in recent years because they let us see the child and the family in their natural environment.